So chapter 9 is about understanding our changing public values, resource uses, engagement processes, and practices. I've come to sort of think of it as the smorgasbord chapter because we cover a lot of topics. And I'm just going to hit on a few highlights today. Some things I'll skip over, or skim over, I should say, because we don't have time to go in depth. But I'm hoping we can get to some of those questions you might have or deeper involved in the conversations, either through the discussions here in the question and answer or beyond that. Thanks to all the co-authors, folks from Oregon State, Portland State, University of Washington, Region 6, and the PNW Research Station. Each author took on a different section of this chapter. I think it is helpful to think of this model that we talked about at the beginning of the day, of the social ecological system. It's a great way to think about how changes in human interactions, such as population dynamics, population shifts, market changes affect the natural environment, and then how large-scale events such as fire or climate change or disease or other factors may affect people and the economies. It's a great model, and what I think we need to do is have better frameworks and tools that are more integrated and across disciplines that help us do research to get to some of these, the systems view. And so I think it's a great way to frame our chapters, and we need further research to be able to do this better. So here's just an overview of chapter 9 and the contents so that you know what's there. I'll first talk a little bit today about public values, attitudes, and beliefs. Then look at issues of place and how we value place. The chapter talks about cultural ecosystem services. I won't get into that in detail today, but we can talk about it later. Outdoor recreation, trust, involving the public, and then agency-citizen collaboration. So there's a lot here. I'll probably spend the most time today talking about the last two items, public engagement and collaboration, because that seems like it's where most of the interest was. But again, if there are questions on other topics, we can do that. So what are values? There's been much research over the past 30 to 40 years trying to define what values are, how they're different from attitudes and beliefs, and how all of these shape actual behavior or actions related to the environment and natural resources. In general, there's differing views, but in general, there's the idea that values are something that are enduring, that are formed at an early age through parenting, through church, through school, and that stick with you over a long period of time. And that these core values influence your attitudes about things, such as clear cutting, or whether or not wolves should be managed, or any other aspect of forest management. Or attitudes in general about what the human's role in nature, or the importance of ecological integrity, for example. But the idea is that values are at the core, and they influence these attitudes and beliefs, which then go and influence people's ideas about how to use the landscape, how to react to measures that are proposed, and engage with nature. I will say that, I mentioned that values are enduring, but they can shift with exposure to new ideas and through learning. And so that's something we'll come back to later. There's been a lot of research on values, but not in the Northwest Forest Plan area. The studies that have been done have been in localized settings, and it's very difficult to generalize across the broader region. But what we can say is overall, in the United States, there's been a shift from the 50s to the 80s where ideas of production were viewed more highly or favorably by people than towards protection, towards a more balanced view in the 1990s and early 2000s, a balance of protection and production when it comes to natural resources. That's a general trend. In terms of the Northwest Forest Plan area, that's been generally true, but with local or sort of sub-regional variation. And one area of sub-regional variation is urban areas tend to be more in favor of resource protection than rural areas. But what we do need, Susan was talking about socioeconomic monitoring that's happened in the Northwest Forest Planning area over the last 25 years. And what I feel like we need is a more systematic study of values, attitudes, and beliefs towards various forest management practices across in those same communities or across the Northwest Forest Planning area. Because as she mentioned, we've had tremendous shifts in population, an influx of new immigrants, and folks moving from different parts of the country. And we've all sorts of changes in development and where people are living. So how do we capture all these changes in values and understand how they affect the Northwest Forest Planning area? We don't really know. We have very little data on this, so we need more. That's just a little bit of a plug. This chapter also looked at attitudes towards forest management, and in general, the studies that we looked at in this area found public support for harvest strategies that mimic natural processes, things such as ecological forestry, and less support for clear-cutting practices, and general awareness about harvesting, especially clear-cutting in old growth areas. So that's taken from a variety of studies that have been in the area over the last 20 years. Now I'm going to shift over and talk about the importance of place. Over the past 20 years, researchers, social psychologists primarily, and many others, geographers, have really been looking at how people connect with place and the attachments and meanings that are assigned to place. People can form attachments to place through actual experiences of being there, taking their families there, hunting, fishing, etc., and going to the same places over time, forming a connection. Or these attachments and connections can be formed through stories and myths and ritual and ideas about place that might be important to your cultural heritage. So they can be experienced exactly, or they can be shared through other means. But these attachments are very important because they affect how people feel about the place and then affect how people might respond to management of those places. So it's becoming more important for public officials to understand people's attachments to places as leading into making management decisions and taking actions to be able to predict and understand where some sensitivities might lie. So place-based planning approaches have developed in the past 10 years that are providing some useful tools for managers to understand the role of place. One tool that we've been working with is participatory mapping, which is using maps as a way to have conversations about how people connect with places by using maps to identify where people have strong special places or attachments, and then where values or benefits are associated with the place. These are, in addition to being data that can be digitized and looked at and integrated with biophysical data, these are really important public engagement tools to guide discussions about how people think about the place and their multiple generations sometimes of relationships there. As I mentioned, the chapter deals with cultural ecosystem services. Briefly, I'm not going to get into this very much today, except to say that there's some great research going on. PNW Research Station, Bob Deal and Nicholas Smith are working on looking at ecosystem services at sub-levels of the forest. Ecosystem services is an important part of the 2012 planning rule, and so it's going to be increasingly important. And it's also a good way to understand what we were talking about earlier, which was the socio-ecological connections across the landscape. So it's a possible framework for getting to where we need to go to have a greater understanding, to look at the benefits that people are getting from places. The cultural ecosystem services are considered those non-monetary benefits, things like enrichment, learning, relaxation, recreation. They're often difficult to quantify and measure. And so that's what a lot of social scientists are working on now, is trying to do that better. Now I'm going to chat about outdoor recreation. Again, this chapter covers a lot of ground, so I'm going to keep skipping along here. In this section, we looked at overall recreation trends, and a couple of things I wanted to share from the chapter is that overall nationwide, we're seeing a growth in recreation, and that's consistent with some of the dialogue that's happening at the Park Service, BLM, other land management agencies. We're seeing steady growth. And it was 149 million over the last planning area of 2011 to 2015. So that's happening at the national level. It's harder to say in the Northwest Forest Planning area. Let's see if I can find my number, but I think it's 15.2 million, if I can grab that really fast. Yeah, in the Northwest Forest Planning Management Area, it's 15 million recreation visits. And the last time it was measured, it was steady or slightly higher than 5 years previous. But we don't have really solid recreation visitation data for national forests. I also should say that the data from the SCORP, which is, I think it's a state comprehensive outdoor recreation P. I'm not sure what that P stands for. Thank you. It shows that 90% of folks in Washington and Oregon engage in outdoor recreation, and 90% of respondents in California actually engaged in outdoor recreation on public lands. So we know recreation is important in the Northwest Forest Planning Area. We just don't have trend data to show it. What we do know is that there's some micro trends happening in recreation that are important to be aware of. We're seeing growth in recreation to day use settings. You might say the front country recreation, places that are close to roads and accessible, and a decline in sort of these backcountry experiences. And so that has implications for how we budget and manage for recreation, and for forests who are thinking and talking about, well, if we're getting more use in these day use areas, do we need to put more of our budgets to parking lots and infrastructure in the areas that are closer to roads? So given dwindling resources and capacity, it presents some difficult management questions. The activities in the Northwest Forest Planning Area that are popular are very similar to the ones that are popular nationwide: hiking, nature viewing, going to visit nature and visitor centers, and viewing wildlife are the most popular outdoor recreation activities. Susan mentioned this earlier about barriers to outdoor recreation, and the biggest ones are lack of time and lack of resources. And I do want to mention that there's some new research that we're doing now, which is looking at trying to understand these barriers to outdoor recreation. And one of the things that Susan didn't mention that I'll just add on to that we found is it's also just a comfort and experience of being outdoors. And it's not so much, money is an issue, access to gear is an issue, but it's knowing how to do it. What do I need to do? What do I need to know? And where do I go? How do I even know anything about where do I go? We just had our third focus group with Latino residents of the Portland area, and they were talking a lot about this. And so they were saying they feel more comfortable going outdoors in large groups that are guided, where people can show them how to do it, and what to wear, and what to be afraid of or worried about, and what not to be afraid and worried about. So this might present some interesting challenges for managers thinking about large group activities when our programs tend to cater to the solo user or small families or small groups. We also looked in this chapter at trust, and I'll just mention a few things about trust. There are different kinds of trust. There's one's natural inclination to trust someone, and that's called dispositional trust. It's something that's kind of like values that comes from your early upbringing about whether you trust folks. There's rational trust, which is based on predictable or reliable behavior for an individual or an organization. I lend a person some money and they pay me back the next time I see them, versus I lend someone some money and maybe they don't pay me back at all, or it takes months to pay me back. So that's how a rational trust gets established. And if you translate that to an institution, it's about, does this agency do what it says it's going to do when they make an announcement or an action or decision? Are they doing what they say they're going to do? Then there's affinitive trust, which is based on relationships that we form, individual personal relationships that we have with others. And finally, procedural trust, which is trust in the process and that the process will lead to the best decision or outcome. So we can dig in deeper to these different kinds of trust, but the research shows that we need 3 of these kinds of trust to be present in order for us to trust an agency or an institution. One, and this will lead to our next conversation about public engagement and collaboration, but be thinking about these different kinds of trust and what processes can build this trust in relationships, this trust in rational behavior, and this trust in having processes that are open, transparent, and recognized as being fair. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last little time talking about public involvement. So we know that participation in land management planning processes is required under various laws and regulations. And so, but there's all sorts of different ways to do public engagement. So we also know that people are more likely to influence the outcome of a decision if there's been trust established in that process, if they have prior experience in engaging with that process, such as previous public engagement experience, and time spent with the process. So that's coming from the research on public engagement. We also know that public engagement processes need to have a clearly defined role and parameters for how the public can be engaged and how the information that they're providing is going to be used in the ultimate management decision. Now, there's been some different research looking at the different kinds of public engagement. And so what I want to point out here is that you need to match the goal of the public engagement with the process that you're using to get there. So one type of public engagement on the far left side of this diagram is to inform. Maybe the purpose of this activity is to inform the public that something is happening and to take questions about that. But the public does not have necessarily a big influence on the final decision. The decision's been made already. So that would require one type of engagement process. Another type is consultation. This is where the public is being asked for feedback before a decision has been made or an action has been planned. Another type would be involvement. This is much more iterative, where you have people involved at the early phases of the public engagement process. They might come back in the middle phases, and later in the phases, there's continual iterative interactions to understand the public needs. And then we have collaboration. This is much more involved, where people are sitting down together, looking at plans and alternatives, working together across agencies, and looking forward to how we might develop an alternative that meets the needs of the collaborative group. That's a different level of engagement. And finally, you have empowerment, where the actual group is making the decision. That's very rare in our context of public land management, because our federal agencies are the ones usually that are making the decision. But there are sometimes situations where a group is empowered to make a decision. So the point here is to develop a process that matches your goal. So if your goal is to inform the public of a decision that's pretty much already been made, you don't want to establish a process of collaboration or deep involvement, because the public will be disappointed that all of their efforts that they put into this engagement process are for naught, because the decision has already been made and it's more of an informational session. So that's something to think about, of how to balance the goals with the type of engagement process that you have, and of course the timing of the engagement. So we could spend a lot of time talking about this framework, but I think you understand the overall depth of it in terms of the ability for the people to engage in the process and share power in decision making. So what we've learned from public engagement research is that the best public involvement practices have clear objectives and timelines. They have parameters of decision making and sideboards, if you will. They have skilled facilitation. So it's that trust in the process is there. There's a philosophy of empowerment and equity and inclusiveness in the engagement process itself, that there's overt strategies to engage a diverse array of stakeholders in the process, including folks from groups that are not traditionally represented. There's research showing early public engagement leads to greater success in the final outcome, and that more frequent engagement is important for success. Finally, finding ways to integrate local knowledge in the process, especially when there's a lot of different kinds of science involved in the process, can be really, really helpful in public engagement success for various types of decisions. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about collaboration. There's been a bit of research on collaboration. We've got a tremendous growth of collaboratives in the Northwest Forest Planning area. Last I counted, there were 25 community-based collaboratives in Oregon, 10 in Washington, and 15 at least in the Northern California area. But it's hard to count them because they keep forming and changing. So collaborative management is where you have a diversity of values and representation in the effort. As the diagram shows, different groups. They could be NGOs, they could be universities, industry groups, other state government, tribes, etc., all sitting around the table trying to examine a problem, look at alternatives, and reach a consensus solution, or at least an agreed upon solution. And collaborative groups rely on and incorporate new knowledge and generate mutual understanding, which if you think about values, that's a way that values can shift is by new knowledge and understanding. So collaboratives can be very important for that process. Collaboratives also help develop that relational trust because you have people sitting down next to each other week after week, deliberating over issues and getting familiarity with each other. If collaboratives are run well, you also have that procedural trust in the process that this will lead to a decision that you may not agree with, but at least you think it was a good decision because you had plenty of time to deliberate in a fair way. The one thing about collaboration is that it's not a panacea. It's not sometimes it's treated as the be all and end all. If we just collaborate, we're gonna get the greatest decision, the greatest engagement. And I think there's a lot of benefits to collaboration, especially in trust building and relationship building, but there are also some challenges. Collaboratives may not be as diverse as we might want them to be. Sometimes we have community-based collaboratives that are made up of 60% of organizations that have traveled 60 or 80 miles to get to the meeting. So they're not necessarily community-based. We're not seeing people of color in collaborative groups. And collaboration and collaboratives tend to work together for a long period of time and develop a shorthand way of communicating with each other, which is very similar to how we speak to each other within natural resource agencies. And so newcomers trying to join the meetings don't really know how to break in and get discouraged and tend to drop out. So we can't think of collaboration as participation or public engagement. It's a type of process that does a certain thing. But if we're trying to reach people who don't come to public meetings, and we're trying to reach people, the missing middle, sometimes they're called, folks who are relying on public lands, but don't necessarily show up and speak out, collaboration is not going to be the answer for that. A few factors associated with success of collaboration is going to sound very similar to what I said about public engagement. Having clear goals, transparent processes, open and available information to everyone, and being organized at an appropriate scale or scope to deal with a problem that's being addressed. A lot of the success factors dealing with collaboration are focused on process, having a way to deliberate, a way to make decisions that's understood and fair and recognized as being valuable. And finally, a success factor associated with collaboratives is having a definable project that's manageable, doable, and understandable, and then follow up on that, whether it's a monitoring plan, an evaluation plan, or some sort of intervention that goes along with it. So this is what we know about our study of collaboratives, much of it based on research done in the Northwest Forest Plan area. So I know I've covered a lot of ground, and it's probably hard to keep track of it all. That's the nature of this chapter, but I'll just kind of do a little summary of what we learned. So that we understand that values are changing with our changing population dynamics, but we don't really have a great way to measure them at the moment. We need to invest more in our ability to measure and monitor values across the planning area. We know that outdoor recreation connects people with public lands. It's growing in the area, and there are many organizations out there trying to find new ways to bring people out to nature who haven't been there before. We know that people form attachment to places, and these attachments can affect how they interact with that place, but also how they participate in planning processes and public engagement processes. We know that trust can be strengthened through relationships, through transparent processes, and through predictable actions and outcomes. And we know that public involvement can improve the awareness of the diverse needs of the people in the broader planning area and lead to better decisions. Finally, we learned a lot about collaboration. It can enhance trust and build relationships. It does require a long-term investment, and it's not a panacea.